My name is Dustin Kelly, but everybody calls me DJ. I'm prior Army, serving as both a Ford observer and a military police officer. I've spent the last 14 and a half years as a police officer and detective in a large metropolitan police department. Two things that I've learned throughout my career. One, everybody has a story to tell. And two, the best stories are true. This is the DTD Podcast. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the DTD Podcast. This week in the studio with me, a retired Sergeant Major with a combined 29 years of professional service to both the United States Marine Corps and the United States Army, serving in numerous positions ranging from a scout sniper to National Security Agency Access Operations Officer. He's also conducted operations with SOUTHCOM, CENTCOM, AFRICOM, EUCOM, and SOCOM, and also the famed Special Missions Unit. His life took a turn after he lost two teammates in a 1-month time period to suicide. My guest decided that after that, not being able to make sense of these losses, that it was time to be an example and get help. Fast forward to life after 2 Stellate Ganglion Blocks and being a team member with the Military Special Operations Family Collabrative, a group that enables the success of SOF Warriors and Families through collaborative health and well-being research and programs. He's here to tell his story of success and failure. It's my honor to introduce Erick Miyares. What's going on?
Not much. Just an honor to be here. I appreciate the invite and such a great intro.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you're here. You and I kind of hooked up on Instagram talking to each other. I found out that you listen to the show and I wanted you to come on and talk. We talked a lot between me and you about stellate ganglion block and different things like that. But as I started looking through your story and reading stuff that you had written, it's amazing from where you came from to where you ended up today. And when I say where you came from, I mean all the way back when you were a kid where you came from. So your family immigrated from Cuba in 1971, and your mother was pregnant at the time with you. Now, luckily, you say that you caught the last flight under the Castro administration. If you know anything about it, can you talk about your family's life before in Cuba and then as you came here, the reasons why, and then what happened after you got here?
Absolutely. Yeah. So what I do know is we were poor, and so education wise, because it always kind of it's at the top of my mind, especially now with my 16-year-old. They were only able to accomplish a six degree education, and that went for my mom, that went for my grandma, my grandparents, and most of the rest of the family, which we had a pretty extended family because of my grandmother and the children that she had, so my mom's brother and sisters. Um, and so my father, actually, my biological father, he actually was a police officer in Cuba. And so obviously I think he had a good education, but he stayed in Cuba. And my mom and dad never married. And so when there was this window of opportunity for them to come, when my mom was pregnant, they got on that flight and they headed to America. And they were welcomed with open arms when they got here.
Now, here's the question that I have for you. I hear about your father and then your stepfather when you were here. Now, your father wasn't in your life a lot. I think it affected some stuff later on, but I want to talk about you saying that you would have been raised differently if you would have been left in Cuba. Now, other than the obvious reasons of why it would be a different family life, is there a way to explain how it would be different, like the opportunities, because your actual dad was there, stepdad was here? Would it have been better, worse? Do you have any idea what it would have been like, or do you just kind of go on, hey, it turned out okay, so let's roll with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd like to say it was probably because my father was a police officer. That's one aspect of it. So I don't know if it was sort of volunteer or it was pre sort of Castro time frame. And then I did know later on. I mean, probably as of recently more so. And just to preface that, so for probably the last 30 years, there was a lot of the background of my family in Cuba that I really didn't want to know. I really didn't ask because of especially once I left the Marine Corps and came into the Army, and more of sort of having those jobs that had a clearance. I did create a barrier between my family in Miami and understanding, our extended family in Cuba. And I didn't know how that would play out, but I knew I wanted to create barriers early on. And so I did end up finding out that I think it was one of my uncles had worked for the Cuban government, had done some technology, and I think worked his way to Russia. And so I say that I just from probably some understanding of my uncles and the way that they were created from my mom and my aunts that have talked to me about them, and just kind of in probably more of as of recent post retirement, just kind of self reflecting on who I am as a person compared to who I became to serve this country. I guess there's something in my DNA, right, from your mom and your dad. My mom was, and so those things that interest me, I figured they probably would have interested me as a boy or a man in Cuba. So probably I would have had the same passion, probably just on that on the island.
I think it's interesting that you say that, though, because I read that you knew about service to your country because of your stepfather being part of the Bay of Pigs invasion. But it's interesting that you say that if you would have stayed there, you probably would have fallen along the same lines and stuff. But it seems like, to me, it's a different thing because you said you didn't know whether your father was kind of conscripted in or whether he took part in it. And you knew that your stepfather had a major role in it, or, he chose to be a part of it. So I wonder, when you talk about father versus stepfather, who you kind of took more. Yes, you have the biological from your father, but it seems like you took more from the stepfather in that life of service, because for all you know, it could have necessarily not been a life of service. It could have been something that was thrust upon him.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. It definitely, my stepfather had the greatest amount of shaping. I did end up seeing my dad, I think maybe a total of 3 or 4 times in my life, right? And so I can definitely tell you that the person I am and how I grew up and what I aspired to be, even to today, as I still talk to him and see how he lives his life at his age. And by the way, and if you hadn't read it before, I mean, he's totally blind. He's been blind for, I think, maybe over 20 something years, right? And it's just and it's still an amazing person, his character, even blind. And so I kind of reflect on that. So to your point, absolutely, he had a great amount of shaping. When I was a kid, I had my grandparents and my uncles. And then I met him by the time I was 8. So that kind of more of that formative age. And after that, I knew I just wanted to be like him. And so that was part of the patriotism, and however it may have worked, him maybe helping my grandparents and my mom sort of shape how I grew up in the streets of Hialeah and Miami, and the activities, the Boy Scouts, Civil Air Patrol, and the things that I did. That's where I also got that more open patriotism, because he was always very quiet about things, but I did kind of learn. So.
But I mean, to his point, being very quiet about his patriotism and stuff, that was kind of the thing you had to be in Cuba. You couldn't really be patriotic unless you were following the rule at hand. And so I can understand where that comes from. Now, being raised by immigrants, but also from a blended home, I started thinking about your childhood. And I want to know kind of how that affected, because not only are you from a blended family and you're learning how to, incorporate these two families together, kind of Brady Bunch style, but you're also being raised by immigrants that are new to the country. And as you know, today, we still continue the battle, legal versus illegal. We talk about that all the time. So being in Florida, being from Cuba, being raised by the immigrants and the blended, how did that affect you? Was it something that you really grew from, or was it something that kind of maybe put a chip on your shoulder a little bit?
I would say I definitely didn't have a chip. It's interesting because Hialeah is where till today, I want to say, because I was just recently there about a year ago for my 50th birthday. And it felt and looked like just like when I was a kid, right? Like it's the one city that brings in a lot of the immigrants when they come in, the Cuban predominantly, and they sort of hustle and and they're making their way, and then they sort of move out and beyond. So when I was a kid, I can tell you I don't think I knew any difference at all. It may have also been that my grandparents, whatever they did and however they afforded it, I know they worked hard because they instilled that in me as a young kid. I went to private school. And so I went to private school that was a bilingual school, English and Spanish, transparently to me. It was just English and Spanish from the moment you walked in through the gates. It's used to call Lavernia Bilingual School. It's no longer it exists there. And then they would teach us both cultures. I learned everything about about the United States. We still studied stuff about Cuba, predominantly more about the United States. But that helped fuse who I was and who I was as a Cuban, right? And then when I went back home, all the kids in the neighborhood and even the activities, if I went to gymnastics or judo, it was transparent. I mean, looking back as I traveled, around the world, I'm like, okay, well, that was the only place where you can speak Spanglish and it is like an official language, right? But that kind of set it in my way. So I never saw anything different till I left to the Marine Corps, and then I started to meet people from different places. I mean, I met people from Louisiana, California, New York, and then that's when I really started to understand that there was even from Latinos or other minorities, they were different than those that I grew up with in Hialeah or sort of the greater Miami.
So do you think when you go into the military, do you think you see more, I don't want to use the word sinister side, but maybe a more dark side to the culture, because you are seeing all of these different people, and I've talked about it before on the show, when you go to basic and when you when you're new to it, you see some crazy things of people that you didn't even think existed. So did you maybe see a different side of it, a darker side to it than you saw back in Hialeah?
I did to an extent. I want to say it was interesting, and again, it could have just been just because it was such a culture shock for me, right? Leaving Hialeah straight to the Marine Corps, and again, and it may be the time frame. And so this was September of 1991, and when I got there, I remember meeting all sorts, but I do remember being instilled, hey, you're all going to be green. Some of you are light green, some of you are dark green from the beginning. And so from the beginning, that's what I took in that Marine Corps DNA early on. And as I mentioned, I wanted to serve this country. I wanted to go in the Marine Corps, and I also needed to get out of the streets of Miami, or I would have ended up, one of three circumstances, right? One of them not very favorable. So I welcomed going into the Marine Corps, and I just wanted to do well, right? Like I drank if you would, the proverbial Kool-Aid. So if there were other things to my left and right, maybe I was too naive or just too excited to be there, and that I didn't see it. Maybe I did see it later on when I went to the School of Infantry, to Marine Corps School of Infantry, and then went to become another MOS that I did. Then maybe I probably started to acknowledge it, but I think I was just happy-go-lucky at that point.
It seems like you talk about that throughout your whole life and anything that you do. And it seems like such a contradiction to me, because as we'll talk later on, you seem to have been happy your whole life, but there was that thing right underneath the surface the whole time. So when you go in the Marines, you go to infantry school, but then you become a scout sniper, and then you start doing counter drug operations. So of course, speaking Spanish, all those kind of things paid off for you. Where were those operations taking place?
So the counter drugs with Joint Task Force 6, that was actually in California. So that was along the mountains of California. And so just to kind of back up 1 second, when I came in when I first did my contract, that I have the only chip I think I do have is probably towards recruiters, right? And I've mentioned this in one of my
I think a
posts.
lot of people have those.
Well, I got sucker punched, right? So because my first contract was my initial contract was active duty, and fast forward, my recruiter, which was actually he wasn't Cuban, he was Puerto Rican. Love him the same, but it was that last minute change of, hey, I can get you out 3 months earlier after you graduate, except you're going to go to yeah, we're going to get you out early. I was like, okay, that sounds good. And then there was the but you're, and I didn't hear the details of it, and then at the end it was, and then we'll get you back on active duty. And so that was coming into the reserves, right? And so when I first came in, I ended up being a tow gunner. And so I did that for a little while, and then I moved around throughout the reserves, and essentially trying to get on active duty and undo the problem. So I went from being a tow gunner, being an Anglico, and then I ended up in the state platoon as serving as a scout sniper, and then going through the training. And so I was just fortunate that and I might have been a volunteer or something we were asked to do, which was this attachment to joint JTF 6 with essentially law enforcement along California. So we were there for a month. But that's essentially the mission, is as a two-man team. It was, spend a couple of days and go find either the marijuana labs or the meth labs. And that was an eye opener for me.
When you see that, though, you kind of get a different view of the United States, because you join the military. I think everyone kind of joins the military to see the world, and they don't really think that there could be stuff going wrong in their country, I guess you could say it like that. And then you go to California and you start running these drug operations, knocking down labs, and you see how bad it actually is, that it's not just across the border, it's in our backyard. And so when you start looking at that, what are your thoughts when you see stuff like that? Because I know you didn't join the Marines to do that, but as you see it and it's kind of exciting, and you're starting to get that thrill out of the Marines, what are you thinking, staying, leaving, moving forward, trying to do something else?
That's a really good question. So I want to say that during that point, I was probably in the middle of my Marine career, and that was one of probably the most fulfilling aspects of it, right? Because you get that training, and above that for me is this constant, wanting to get on active duty and move on with the train, right? And go do that. So I was kind of stuck between going to college and then dropping out of college to go to airborne or some school in support of building a military career. And when essentially, I think it was only maybe two or four of us that got to go do this from the greater platoon. So that was an honor to be chosen to do that. And the teammate that I had, we just worked really well together. I want to say that the eye opener aspect of it was, oh God, these people want to essentially harm us. And I mean that because there was booby traps, right? And so nowhere in in Marine Corps basic training, infantry, tow gunner, or any of the other stuff that I had done at that point was that being taught, because that was kind of more on the counter drug stuff that isn't standard curriculum during that time. That was kind of literally OJT. I want to say I probably did a 2 or 3 day, Defense Intelligence Agency counter drug course, and then it was straight to go meet your liaison officer with the law enforcement agency. Oh, and here's this thing called posse comitas, right? So the big things was for me, and again, coming from the streets of Miami, I grew up around drugs, right? I grew up around knowing friends that went down that way, friends that ended up in jail, or myself, being in a couple of binds where I'm like, okay, this is why I had to join the military, or ultimately, there was a high propensity I probably would have ended up going down the wrong road. So now I'm in California, in the U.S., and yeah, I get to play Marine, play two-man scout sniper team. I think it looked like some Tom Clancy movie, and we're going to go look for this stuff until you find that first no crap booby trap, and this is between two trees. It's I don't know if it was fishing wire, it was just a steel wire, and at the other side of it, I remember at that point crawling as we're getting close, and there's a shot-off shotgun taped or on a tree. And so that to me was actually very impactful. Interestingly, I think I actually talked about that, now 29 years later when I'm preparing to retire and I'm at the National Intrepid Center of Excellence, where they're doing this whole PTS all the way back to like a childhood. I'm like, I do remember being scared shitless when I was in California looking for drugs, and this lady's like, "Well, but everything else that you've gone through." Well, I'm like, "Well, now you're taking me back in my memories and my psyche." So, sorry, this went a little bit long winded, but that ingrained. I learned early on, survivability. I learned on that, and that I would later on, then in 7th Special Forces Group, also do stuff for counter drugs, and then later on in the unit involved with similar stuff at a different level. So crawling around the mountains of California, looking for meth labs and marijuana, like at the end, I learned that that's somebody's livelihood. Someone's going to protect it, and someone's going to do something that you're probably not thinking about. And be careful where you step, because you might step on a bear trap. So that's a good question.
Well, and to kind of tack on to that, in that scout sniper position, that's a very interesting dynamic to work with, especially as a young guy. It's you and your partner out there, whether you're sniper or you're spotter for him. That's a very unique dynamic to work with. And then when you throw in the fact, like you said, where you're coming across booby traps and learning for the first time kind of in your young life, like, hey, there's people out here to get me. How did that impact you later on? Because you had to, like you said, when you get brought back, you had to have thought of that stuff later on as you join special forces and different things like that. It has to put your head in a different mind state.
It did. I want to say that it was, as I mentioned earlier, so, posse comitatus. So before that, anything you did at the equivalent of the 29 Palms or the JRXs, whatever they were for the Marine Corps, that's all fake landia, right? Like it's, you're looking at either a tow missile, or when I was a forward observer doing, Anglico calling naval gunfire, it's just kind of pretend, but when you're actually calling in, when you called in the site, and so I remember this one mission, if you would, we would go out for about 2 to 3 weeks, right? So it's like a 2-day infill of just you and your buddy, whatever you can take. And the heaviest thing I think was the big plugger, the GPS that was like about that big. And that was the number one thing we did. And ammunition was the least amount of stuff that we carried. But once that phase of that one operation, I remember that then the aspect of it was they're going to come, and I don't know if it was a DA or whatever, whoever they were going to come and take the lab. And what we were going to do is, once they were in the air and they landed and they started to do their work, we went into an overwatch position, right? Because we had located, we called back, and then we sat there for about a day, just observing everything. And then the helicopters come in. Well, once they come in, give or take, then they would initiate that posse comitatus. And so now we're looking down that scope, and you're there to protect that police officer. And then it sinks, and we had learned about what that would be, but you're just like, okay, that's probably not going to happen in my little time out there. But it did. And so now I'm looking down the scope at these guys doing that raid, and I'm like, I'm just a young kid, so I don't know, 18, 3 years. And I'm looking down the site, and I'm like, okay, well, obviously don't hit the police officer, don't hit that, right? Like all of these things are going on. So as a young Marine in that position with my buddy, and you're tired, I went through that very fast. And I want to say that, at least in the Marines, the stuff that I did, in the state platoon as a scout sniper wasn't anything that these young Marines are doing now, but it really took it defined me. I really paid attention to that responsibility behind that sniper rifle, and you're calling something in, or and in that particular case, you've got to make the determination that if that officer's in trouble, you don't have the authorities till that second to react. So your rules of engagement are that it's that gray area. And so that taught me early on what it was to be in the gray area, which then later on I would do that for 23 years, essentially, always in the gray area.
Well, let's talk about what you talk about being a young guy and having to make those decisions, because like you said, when you're doing your Forward Observer stuff, it's kind of play, you're hitting fake targets and things like that. Now you're on real world missions. And as the GWOT came and has been around for as long as it has, you're starting to get back into this thing where you're getting young guys that are joining the military, specifically going to special forces to do special operations and things like that. So you get a very much younger crowd than you would agree than you were when you joined special forces.
Mm-hmm.
So in thinking back on that situation and these new guys coming in, what are your thoughts on that? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Does it build a better soldier because you get all the bad habits out of the way? What are kind of your thoughts overview of it?
That's good. That's a great question. And so I did do part of our training pipeline just to be simple. And so I would have a lot of hands-on for several years on the new generations that came in to my previous command. And the one thing, by the time we did it, we tried to explain, and this is at a one-to-one level, which with the guy or the girl that we were mentoring. And after a certain phase, once you're seeing these young guys or girls being accepted, being accepted, you're kind of now doing that mentoring, right? Even though at the last day they can not be accepted, you're still mentoring this soldier, this individual, right? And so a lot of them, what I would put in would be that ability for that person to think and to understand. We taught a lot by kind of like the way the Indians taught, right? Like around the campfire, of not, hey, this is what I've done, but here's the possibilities of the things that you will be involved in, right? Because our GWOT, my last 20 years, I can't say with just Afghanistan and Iraq. It was global, on a constant deployment. I would have to almost take off Afghanistan GWOT, put it down, put another chip, if you would, and then go do something else. So you had to have that mentality. And that's part of the screening process. That's part of the assessment, selection, and then the mentoring, and tell the folks, hey, this is not a video game. This is not what you're seeing on TV, what you're seeing on Instagram. This isn't, you're not going to be wearing this cool guy clothes. And I want to say for the young guys, that's almost how you had to relate to them, right? Or maybe I think for the older generations, maybe you were using different ways to get the point across. And so we always would teach in a given course, almost every mission that was going on globally, and the psychology behind it, and the mental aspects, and the differences to really enforce going, hey, you may go and do 3 weeks, and I'll get to the point here, and you're going to run around doing stuff, with the other tiers, supporting direct action or any of these other missions. And then when you come back, I need you to flush that out, reset, and then I'm going to send you on a strategic mission. And so to your point, for the next guys, and in particular what's going on now with Ukraine and Russia, I think I actually posted something like that about 6 months ago, and it was just a photograph of sort of clothing and the mindset going, hey, guys, this is, this is what you're going to need to be ready for. It is that ability. Don't get focused on just going out and doing, supporting direct action missions or this kill, these find, fix, finish. In special operations, it's going to be completely different. Hopefully that answers what you're getting after.
Yeah, I think it does, but I want to go drill a little deeper into that. And because we're going to talk about mental health a lot between you and I, because that's what kind of brought us together talking about it. I guess to drill down a little further in it, does that make them more mentally prepared? Because I think that, you talk about people failing people. I think the military failed at certain levels of preparing you mentally for this stuff. Yeah, they can tell you that you're going to go run these missions for the next 20 years and you're going to do everything and you're going to be okay. But then when it's all said and done, and like you say, Pandora's box opens up, it's a different world out there. It's a jaded world. It's an angry world. It's a lot of, nighttime fears that come back. So are we making with that mentoring? Are we making them more mentally prepared? Are we getting better mentally prepared people from the start? What are we doing on that front?
I'd like to say that we're starting to identify that we haven't done a good job. And I'll get to the point. It's because we're having a lot of suicides. We're having a lot of suicides committed by, highly trained, highly screened, highly, if you throw all those words in there, but that person who's supposed to have that mental toughness is committing that suicide, right? And as you mentioned in the opening, and that's what just was the snowball effect for me. So, but I'm, and hope is not a viable course of action. That's kind of why I'm also part of this MSOF and I'm listening to what SOCOM's doing and the CX doing. I think they're slowly doing it. I don't want. I want to say it's not fast enough. I don't know because I left the force, and that's one of the things is once you leave, right? All I can say is I'm hoping to do it, and that's what I'm trying to do from my side, reaching back. But as we know, the military is probably not at the speed that we would like it to build that mental or have folks understand that they need to have these tools in place to take care of these soldiers and Marines.
Don't you think it's important though, and I'm speaking from a law enforcement standpoint, but I want to tie it to your military service where you say something kind of disheartening right there where you say once you're gone, you're kind of gone. They cut you out of the pie and you're pretty much done. You can help on the side when people come to you, but you can't go back in. Don't you agree, though, that it's a good idea? Maybe you can't train for the battle that's going on there, but you can train them for the battle that's going on back home, whether that be in law enforcement, whether that be in military. Why do you think it is that, once again, law enforcement and military cut those guys out and just do not let them? Is it because they're scared that it's going to do something to the mental toughness or make people think? What is it that they won't let them come back in and teach them? This is how you're going to deal with it on the backside, because all this stuff you're doing right now is not going to matter when you're 50, 55, 60 years old. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I don't, so there are just some standard, right? Like I can't go, there are certain organizations that for security reasons, you're kind of read off. But that, there these networks, these connections are pretty tight, right? Like when you come from some of these organizations, for the most part, you stay connected. The smart leaders, which are generally our friends, right? So the leaders that are there today are at least for my organizations, they're guys that I grew up in the organization, and for some part, if you're enlisted, the officer in charge, he was probably at some point you had some aspect and welcome them into the organization and help mentoring them. I want to say that those that then have left, for example, myself or those that I'm following their footsteps, right? Like the Tom Saddleys, the Tom Spooners, and some of these other guys that I look up to because they are helping the force, and so in that aspect, I am happy to see how a lot of commands from the Navy, from the SEALs, the Air Force Special Operations, the Marine Corps, and even the Army are reaching out individually. And I want to say these are some key leaders are reaching out to individuals, just for example, as myself and others, to listen to our opinion, right? Because I think we're reaching that point where we are stepping up again and saying, "Hey, I'm trying to help. I'm just one more tool in the toolbox. I'm trying to give you a perspective. Um, I don't want another brother to die or another young guy to die. And I think your mental health is going to be extremely important in future wars. So you may want to just at least listen to us or a perspective. Hopefully that answers what you're trying to get at. I think I want to say it is getting better from what we're seeing. The leaders at the SOCOM level, at least at the USOC level, in the Army side, and what I've seen from the Marine Corps, they are listening, and in the Air Force, excuse me, they are listening to those that came before them and are trying to provide advice or share. Right?
Yeah, and the way I look at it, and once again, speaking from a law enforcement point of view, what you see is you get told, hey, if you think you're having a problem, if you think you're having PTS or whatever it may be, come and talk to someone, maybe someone that's been through it. But there's still not as bad, but there's still that stigma there that is blocking a lot of people. And I think that's what's leading down the wrong road, which is why we need those guys to go, listen, I've been there, I've done it, and it doesn't mean anything now. What matters is you. And I think that, I will say it in law enforcement, I think we're still a long ways away from that.
I agree. I think we're a long way just because these are humans. That this isn't hardware, right? These are humans, and the thing with the human is there's secondary and tertiary, meaning there's a spouse, there's children, right? There's friends, there's up and coming next generations that are seeing how for law enforcement or what they're seeing on social media of guys having issues. So I think I want to say it's critical, right? Because these are human beings at that side. And so there is something you said about, like the police officers and the guys. And there are, especially with what we just talked about, SGB and some of these other treatments. I want to say and for example, a lot of these other nonprofits are actually, even though it's probably more on the quiet side, it's just not so socially available, but they're coming back and they're providing training and they're providing help to these units. And I want to say that some of it has to do of people that know each other and they trust, because there's a lot that has to do with trust, right? And they're trusting that, hey, there's former CSM, there's former 2-3 star general or colonel, whoever they were, is going back and reaching to their peers where they came from and said, hey, you may want to listen. And I think that's actually working really well. So it's, not only from the bottom up, but from the other angle, having these folks listen.
Well, I want to talk about some of the traumas that you have dealt with along the way, because I think it's going to all kind of culminate in the end. I want to talk about Ecuador first, where you received your first Purple Heart. Once again, counter narcotics missions, in a convoy and your ambush. Can we go over that story, what you were thinking then, and then how it kind of molded what you were going to do the rest of your time?
Yeah, absolutely. So what was I thinking was probably a couple of hours prior to that, nothing was going to happen, right? At that point, here's me just thinking, I'm a former Marine who is now in the Army. I'm a military intelligence professional, kind of enjoying what I'm doing in that stage of my career. So I think at that point I've probably been 1 year in SF, in 7th Special Forces Group. So I'm enjoying what I'm doing. I'm in I think there was probably, I don't know, about 30 something other, there were 30 something Green Berets. We were 20 vehicle long convoys. Like, nothing's going to happen to us, right? Like, it can't. I mean, this is just a FID mission in Ecuador. It's not Colombia, so I had known more from an intel side, and obviously open reading that Colombia would have been essentially more dangerous. So your guard is a little bit down, and so hours prior to that is and so I was in the leading vehicle. My job was to provide force protection from a SIGINT perspective, right? And so a couple of hours into the trip, it was just, one town going, it was just kind of normal till the little hairs in the back of my hair start standing up. And I want to say that that was probably more of my street smarts than it was anything that I learned in the Marine Corps, maybe some experience from the stuff that I did with counter narcotics. But it was definitely from the streets, right? That was just, you start kind of getting that sense of it's not looking right. And then right as we kind of come around that bend, just to get into one aspect of it, I had gotten a break of squelch on sort of the intel side, which was not normal. And at that moment, I'm preparing to, or I went ahead and gave notification, hey, they're saying something's not right. And then as we come around, it's literally almost like in slow motion. Then we start to receive fire, and then I'm like, okay. At that point, as now in retrospect, I remember feeling as I went back into being a Marine, right? Because prior to that, yeah, I'm understanding, but that's not my job, right? I was just there to do my military intelligence job, which I was very proud of doing. All the SF dudes are gonna, they're gonna do their job, but once we got that fire, then initially that's what that adrenaline kicked in, and I was like, okay, it's time to go back into the infantry realm.
Do you think this is the point where you start locking away bad things in your life?
I did. I put it away, but I didn't realize I put it away. And as I've mentioned before in another interview, till I was retiring, till once I, and so for understanding, 2019 is when I asked for help, and is when my two friends, they committed suicide. And that's when I finally broke down and asked for help. And when I went to help in that next 6 months to a year, and they're asking me all of these questions and walking me back, that I then realized that that was the beginning of my first major PTS, right? Like it's an ambush. You're in a gunfight. You're danger close, if you would, and you get shot. That wasn't an exercise, and that wasn't a JTF-6 in California with posse comitatus. That was real. However, I think what transpired was I got pulled out of country 2-3 days later, just because of where we were and the level of the command wasn't ready for that. We were probably more ready for a training accident than we were for what ended up being a hostile engagement. And so I get flown out for whatever political reasons or medical reasons, and end up back in Fort Bragg 2-3 days later. However, my mind and what my responsibility was still there with that team, because my team at that point, the SOD-A's, Special Operations Team Alpha, that were there to provide force protection and language and a bunch of other strategic capabilities. I wanted to be back in that fight. So as soon as I can get out of that hospital and in my crutches and back into group, into the skiff, to continue to provide force protection, that was my purpose. That was my adrenaline. But the incident was just locked away. And I didn't think about it again for essentially 29 years.
Okay, so when you say you locked it away, I get that, but are you doing it consciously or subconsciously?
I want to say at that point that was subconsciously, right? It went from, oh crap, I got shot, I'm okay. I get back to the United States, and then I have this purpose, right? At that time, it is I'm recovering, and I have a purpose to get back to group, to go down and continue to provide, force protection, if you would, from Fort Bragg to the guys that were in Ecuador. And at the same time, I knew that I had gotten accepted to go to selection. So additionally, I'm thinking, okay, you got to get ready to heal, right? So as so I had two driving forces. So to your point, it was subconscious, right? The whole gunfight was just put away to the side because I had more important things to do, which was continue to help that team that was forward. And then at the same time was start getting ready for selection. So that was definitely subconscious, and I just put it away.
See, and I would think, and the reason I ask that, I would think it would be more conscious in the beginning and subconscious later on. And the reason I say conscious is because you really have two different war fronts going on. You need to get back to your team, but you also have to heal for selection. So you couldn't be at more opposite ends of the spectrum. One keeps you here, one puts you there. So in your brain, you're constantly saying, okay, no matter which side that I'm going to, I have to put this away and move on. And then as you get through those things, then it kind of turns into a subconscious, like, yeah, I was okay. So I made it through. I'm good. And you just kind of lock it away.
You're right. There's another interesting point, which is in the beginning, they thought the initial assessment, that was just we just happened to stumble across, something. And so that in effect was also downplayed. Again, there was no war on terrorism. This wasn't anything that we can tie back. We were just going to go do a FID mission, right? And so there also was an aspect of it's a little bit different when you prepare to go to Afghanistan, Iraq, or a non-permissive environment, and you've prepared for that. It didn't take till I think several months later where USASOC and the IC, the intelligence community, then figured out, no, that actually weren't just typical criminals, which is what they first thought they were. That was actually, the FARC, i.e., which is what led to getting the Purple Heart. Because at first they were like, oh, okay, what are we going to do with this, right? We have an ODA that gets into a gunfight, right? And there was other stuff that the brave SF guys that were there, they took out several guys, and so they got their awards. I got my awards, but to get there, then they had to go from, hey, they were just thugs, to no, this was actually an insurgency that and I think that may have played into it. Where I don't know. Later on, I do know that I did pay attention to everywhere I went.
So let's talk about 20 plus years of deployment. That was, before that time period, before 2001, that was unheard of. I mean, I've talked to a couple of guys that were going into special operations, whether that be SEAL or whatever, where they were worried they might not get to go to any battle before 2001 happened. When 9/11 happens, it kind of opens up all these different things. So I want to go from enduring freedom all the way to, SOCOM and working with special missions. And if we can, I want to briefly, because there's so many of them, briefly go over each one, but I want to see how your mind state changes from the beginning until the end and until the very end where you say it's time to step away.
Absolutely. So right after Ecuador, I went through selection. I want to say I didn't hear anything. And then shortly after, we redeployed into 7th Special Forces Group to Colombia. So we went to Colombia to do a very similar FID mission. In that one, I had a little bit more of an integrated role because of Spanish, helping the sort of the ODA with the police. And so that was really good, from working closer with sort of that local force. That later on, I would file that as a trait and a capability that I knew that I can count on. And then I got accepted and came back and came into the course, right? And then so when I started that, it just really brief. It was a long process. And it wasn't until the last minute that I knew I had been accepted. And going through that whole thing, through the whole training part, it was just, there was points that sucked, but there was times that were, this is what I want to do, right? All the way from my childhood, all the way to my stepfather, all the way. It just felt so right. Just the way. I still remember my mentors and how they taught me things, and opened, to your point, we were getting ready for everything because there was no GWAT, to our earlier conversation. So it wasn't just about Iraq and Afghanistan because it hadn't happened yet. It was about be prepared to do this, this, this. And a matter of fact, there's a picture that I posted on Instagram, and it's got like 30 something pairs of shoes, right? And there are a variety of shoes from sneakers to dyed boots to high heels to just everything, right? And what that captured was a CSM that I'd had that in I think when I first signed in, he's like, hey, be prepared to wear any of these shoes, right? The metaphor of these shoes. And so that ingrained it in me. So as soon as I graduated, I went into sort of more of a tactical team. So that's kind of where I did a lot of my liaison with a lot of the other tiers, which was comfortable, right? Because I came from sort of more of that Marine background, had been in group, and I already had been a little bit of an engagement. But then my first mission was actually a traditional, non-pervasive cookie cutter, what the unit does. And so that had a little bit of excitement in it. And so when I came back, I'm like, this is great, right? That this was really good. And then shortly after that, September 11 happened, and then it just all changed, right? So at least for me, that first mission, I was able to go through why I had gone through selection, why I had gone through the course, and everything I had learned, and came back, and then was off to the GWAT. So I'll stop there just in case there's something you want to expand from.
No, I don't think so. I'm just trying to figure out, you're kind of at the not beginning, but close to the beginning of your special operations career. So what rank are we looking at right now? What units are you assigned with, and all these kind of things, and how are you looking right before and then right after 9/11?
Yeah, so I came into when I left the Marine Corps, I was an E5, came into the Army. They made me an E4, so I had to start as a specialist. So by the time I got to group, I was an E5, and then got to the unit, which then again, I was only in 7th Special Forces Group for 2 years. After I switched from the Marines into the Army, went through that training, and then my first assignment was 7th Special Forces Group, and I was only there for 2 years, and then I came into the Army SMU, and I came in as an E5. Went through selection in '99. Started by the time I graduated, it was December of 2000, and then retired as an E9 in October of 2020. So as an E5 was.
That's got to be crazy, though, being an E5 going to the elite of the elite. I mean, that is a ton of pressure on your shoulders, not just mission sense. In you, though, you have the weight of the world on your shoulders. And I mean, let's be honest, as an E5, yeah, you know what you're doing, but this is on a whole nother level.
Yeah, I got. I was told to, I was told to go in that corner and draw several times. Right, that was one thing that I will give to my mentors. They put me in my place all the time, as they would do to everyone else. So, as I looked back, I was probably more of an idiot than I needed to be. Right, and I'm very, very fortunate that I was able to stay there 20 years. I got to imagine there's a secret file somewhere of where they really wanted to get rid of me, right? But no, it was, right? And so I think it was just the folks that were there, they trust the process. So, just to keep that simple, we trust our selection process, we trust our course, and then definitely the mentoring, right? So by the time I got to my first team, I had a few restrictions just because of stuff that I had done before, but there was plenty of work. And so the guys that took me under under their arms, all the time. Hey, I got it. You speak Spanish. So what? Go learn Guarani. Go learn French. Go learn this. Oh, that's great. You're airborne. Okay, go to MFA. Right. So it was just this constant proven. And even the interesting piece was, at certain times later on, probably more when I'd been there, maybe, 6, 7, 8 years, then it wasn't necessarily rank dependent. Yeah, someone was always in charge, but if you know what you were doing, you took lead, right? And so that was that type of organization. However, experience was different than what you knew to do, or if you were the right, I was always the token little brown guy, right? Good. And so if that needed to be exploited and being used, then I would go do it, right? It's just, hey, Cubano, you're gonna go do this, or hey, you Marine, go do this, or hey, Skippy, you're the low guy, go do all the S4 stuff. So yeah, the rank was interesting, but we also didn't wear the rank. You also had to earn every day. And from day one, we learned that. And so I think that's where kind of the rank almost went away in essence, because you earn that keep every day. You always tried to do whatever you were doing better. Hopefully that kind of helps a little bit on that aspect.
Do you think it's the same as a E5 sergeant and as a sergeant major, still earning that keep the exact same way?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And in particular, I would say the sergeant major, because there's so many jobs, right? Like at the end, you're still Army billets, you're still TDA, right? So at this point, in there aren't very many folks that get to stay anywhere for 20 years. And so that's a lot of creativity. And so I was very fortunate that in my pipeline, I probably would have extended my stay because of just I was fortunate to make rank at a good pace. Um, However, I had diversified in technical um, and some other operational skills that I had developed, where it gave me some more dwell time in the organization. And then I came towards the end, the last position I did, which was, I think, the best position I loved to have done. I was the CDD sergeant major for the unit, and that comes with a lot of responsibility. Yeah, sure. A squadron CSM, a unit CSM comes with obviously a lot more. But for me, as I made my way in that organization, realizing the importance of capabilities to support the human, if you would, was a great responsibility.
Can we talk about the differences in the wars that you see after 9/11? Can we talk about the difference in Enduring Freedom, Southcom, CENTCOM, AFRICOM,
Yep.
the different areas that you're seeing in the world? Can we just get kind of a 30,000 feet view of the differences that you're going through? Because you and I have talked over and over in this conversation talking about wearing all those different shoes. So can you kind of fill us in on what shoes you're wearing as you're going through?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So the again, as I said, the first one in 2000, I was initially in the highest readiness. Right, we were in the highest readiness. So it's an element that, for simple terms, you're just ready to go. Right, something happens, you're ready to go, and so that means if you work backwards from being ready, that's a lot of training. That's a lot of approvals you've got to get. Right, and so that was comfortable because it was hard skills and I enjoyed the hard skills at that point, even though I was buying away from, the what will later become the little brown guy, right? Hey, that's something you bring to the table. So I would have to go back to that. So the first part was that for about a year, because there was, well, that first part, there was nothing going on. There still was not September 11th, but there were other things going on in the world at a higher level, just to keep it simple, right? So I lived off of a pager, which shaped the beginning of my relationship with my spouse, trying to explain to her what it meant to have, a bag and a pager, and I could only go, an hour away from where we lived. That started to shape sort of my life and my wife's, or my girlfriend at that time. And then I went to go do sort of my first mission, which again, as I mentioned, was in the Southcom area. And then September 11th happens. At that point, I was in BNOC, right? So, and everybody probably has a story. I'm in there with actually one of my classmates. we're going through the land nav course thinking, God, I can't wait to get back to work so we can go on other deployments. September 11 happens, we go back, we see it on the TV, and we were hoping we would get a phone call, right? Because we were naive at that point and thought that we were going to be sent home. But we had to finish BNOC and we catch up. And at that point, our peers, the guys that we had gone through the course with, and subsequently the guys at Fort Bragg and the guys at the beach, which, coming in through our OTC courses together, those guys are out the door. So I didn't get to go the first wave. I get to go back down to sort of the SOCOM to do one more operation. And then
let me ask you something
back,
though. Let me stop you for just a second.
Yep.
Those guys that go out the door, that what they're doing. You said in BNOC you want to go there. Is that needling at you? Is that going at your head, or are you good with it?
We're good with it. We're good with it at that point because there was a lot of trust and still a lot of things that we didn't understand. We were still new guys, brand new guys in the team, right? So if my team sergeant or and I can didn't call me, then early on I was taught, don't worry about it, Skippy. When it's time for you to go, you'll be told to go. So a lot of that, I don't want to say that mental resilience. It's whether it was, hey, focus now on what you need to do, which I learned early on, right? So yeah, we saw stuff going on because the rest of BNOC or the rest of the base is freaking out. We kind of knew that we came from a different organization, and that we would be doing something at some point. And in fact, the guy that I was at BNOC with, he was an Arabic speaker, right? So, obviously I was more of the romantic languages. So we knew he would be going out the door. I probably thought that at some point I would be being called, but they would be the right time in the right place. But that's a good question. No, I didn't have that early on till we got back. And then you felt more of when those first wave of, the SMUs and the guys and the SF guys started to go out, and you started to get the reports of what's going on and what they're doing. That was then new to everybody. And then you're just like, okay, now I want to go help. I want to be part of that fight because of what you're hearing. You wanted to be part of it, but they were also undergoing some struggles that you wanted to be part of.
Not only struggles in being a part of it, they're making history.
Yeah, that didn't at least for me, that wasn't part of my thought, because I was already involved in other things. Yes, this was September 11, but at the organization, there was other things going on.
Right.
Obviously, it wasn't but there was a lot of discipline and going, hey, there were still guys and teams going to all other aspects of the world. Yeah, things slowed down, but that didn't stop rotations. That didn't stop you from going to replace another team or other things that needed to be done. And that was very clear, right? And then we were also kind of broken down in a way that you knew you would have to go continue your job unless once those guys started to burn out, and then we were cross-pollinating teams, if you would.
But that's very interesting to think of it that way, because I think that people looking at it from the outside in, they see 9/11 and that's all they think about. They don't think about everything that was going on in the world. And I guess I can say I'm even guilty of that, because when you think about it and you think about everything that's going on with 9/11, you do put aside that there's still stuff going on in Malaysia. There's still stuff going on in Thailand. I mean, there's a lot of terrorist cells even that are moving around in these other countries. With that, moving around with SOUTHCOM, CENTCOM, all those, you're addressing terrorist issues, correct?
You are. And then you're also doing what I would just, for simplicity, just put at the strategic national security level, right? That then is another level, right? And so it becomes more distinct when you're having to take 3-4 months to prepare for that level of activity, which means, again, to sort of that analogy, hey, I'm going to take this tactical rucksack off and in this gear and in this mindset, and put it to the side and go and get the other mindset of what I may need to do. Because going, and it goes back to what you're saying about the new guys. It's like, hey, it's sometimes, depending where you're at, it may not just be going after, find, fix, finish terrorists in Afghanistan or Iraq. You may need to go work in an embassy. You may need to go be a liaison officer at an intelligence community. You may need to go undergo a 4 or 5 month, which was usually very painful. You're going to go learn how to do this thing that's going to take you 4 and 5 months. And you better put your mind to it, because the command is sending you and one more guy, and it's at that level. And so that's kind of where you're going, okay, I got it. I need to focus. And that literally means just as bad as a commitment as going to go fight GWAT, that you're going to go to a training, that you leave family here and you go commit to that, because then you got to follow on responsibility.
So I don't want to get too deep into your combat, because I think that you and I really focused, that we talked about really focusing on everything that's happening. So to kind of wrap up the combat things, I want to hear mental state at 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years.
Good. Thank you. So from the beginning, 5 years, that would encapsulate the Marine Corps. The worst part was probably the counter narcotics, and really just looking down that scope for the first time, either in an exercise or as a sniper, or in that counter narcotics, and what that meant, right? Especially pre GWAT. And then shortly after that, the gunshot in Ecuador was still kind of like, I didn't believe it, and I had other things to focus on, and then that would unpack itself later on. And then so right around that 5 to 10, and I get into the Army, into the special operations. The first part of it, I want to say just about almost all of my trips had something. Either it was a potential compromise in a non-permissive environment, or in a tactical environment would be, some sort of some engagement, some kind of battle, or understanding that there was losses, or we were trying to, rescue folks. The mental didn't really take its greatest toll till 2006 December, when I was in Ramadi doing essentially a sensitive operation, and we're hit by an RPG within meters, and thrusted against an iron fence, and then into, just to paint that picture, that was supposed to be sort of that not low vis, it's more of that covert hitting within another operation, right? And so there's this larger operation sweeping through Ramadi, a called on sweep, and I was embedded, and had an element that was allowing me to do what I needed to do. And so yes, it was a risky environment operating in Ramadi, but the way it was being handled, it wasn't like it was going to end up being the way it was. So when that RPG hit, it was a shock, right? Because we had just found the target, left the target in its place, were walking out, and then got struck. And then ensued about a 6-hour, between contact, moving, and then going up to a building, call for fire, and then for me, passing out and not realizing that I had passed out, and ended up back at our, at where we were staying at the compound. And from there, later on, is then a month later, and this will get to a point, I literally went from, Iraq to South America, and I wasn't supposed to go, but something had happened, and then I wasn't even processing that, right? That I had TBIs, that I had gone through a lot of mental things that had, that had taken its toll really heavily. And in time, as I can look backwards, right? Because you didn't know this, and so what I want to be able to say is, in all of this, I didn't know to 2019 how bad the tires had fallen off. At that point, the tires had fallen off. I can probably go back and say, hey, there was times where I was stressed, or I was realizing that I was not able to pass my language test or absorb languages as fast, or if I would go to very certain tradecraft courses where there's a lot of memorization, I was having problems with memorization, or I'm having issues with memory, right? Like just cognitive processing, because I didn't even pay attention to temper. So 5 was not bad. 5 to 10 is what I probably had a lot of things happen, but had no idea. And again, as you had mentioned, and what happens is when we come back from these trips, and it's an administrative function, and there's a point here, we literally come back, you fill out this travel voucher, and you put it into these these manila colored folders, and you put your travel vouchers, a bunch of documents, a bunch of things in there. You seal it, you write the name on top of it, and you put it in your safe. I had done that, I don't know, 20, 30 times in that time frame. This is where I kind of call my Pandora's box. But part of that was also going, okay, I'm putting all of these memories of what happened, let's just say in Iraq, and I'm putting it away, because now I've got to go to a strict. You're literally putting it in there, but you're also then, here's the other thing, you got to come back home. So you got to clear in your mind what you are and you're not going to talk about, and so there's the typical, where there's secrets you just can't talk about at home, but there's also things you don't want to say in front of your family, because you don't want your spouse or your children to know you got blown up by an RPG. My wife did not know that I got hit by an RPG or had, any of these incidents, till 2019. So for, whatever amount of 15 years, she never knew. I never told them, because you're also scared of your spouse going, okay, this is way too dangerous. You got to leave, or we're going to get divorced, right? Because you see everybody else. So what also happens is you're putting all of these emotions, all of these fears, and you don't want to talk about it. You're putting it in that envelope, and you're just locking it up. So by the time it is 2010, so now we're at that 25 year mark, I'm starting to identify my mentors. I'm like, man, you're an asshole. Like, what is wrong with you? And those weren't like how I'm hoping the conversations are happening in the team room now. Like, hey man, did you have a traumatic brain injury? Just like getting to the point of talking about PTS, talking about TBI, talking about moral injuries. At that point, it was like, dude, what the hell's wrong with you, right? And how that also equates was your NCOER is tanking, right? So that's when I'm starting to have these issues right around that 2015 timeframe. To your point, that's that right at that 25 year mark, where now I'm also, from a leadership perspective, going, I'm probably not going to go back up the road, because I've now worked my way to do these, these more leadership positions in the organization. But I'm starting to feel, well, my wife's telling me, you're not sleeping. You're a freaking zombie, right? Like, you get up, you're shaking, you're stretching, your body hurts, or I'm having these debilitating episodes, muscular, skeletal, or I'm just forgetting things, right? And that was bad, right? And those become the, what is wrong with you? You need to go see a doctor. Hopefully that kind of answers that.
It absolutely does. But I want to go back to something. You said that you don't tell your family getting blown up, and because you're worried, they'll do this. So question one to that is that fair? And number two, is that more for you or more for them?
that was more for me. So I would tell you that was selfish. That was really selfish, and I didn't know that till now, till later on, post retirement, post therapy, all of this, that I realized, crap. Not being able to obviously talk about sensitive stuff, that's one thing.
Absolutely.
To share with the family, but there's also this aspect of, and I'll keep it simple here. There's certain deployments that, okay, that happened in that deployment. There's other deployments that, because of the sensitivities of it, I am so happy that, or I'm fortunate that those weren't deadlier, or they weren't more catastrophic, because then that would have been much more muddier. So it became this really bad, to your point, where we just hit it under the table, right? You keep on protecting so many aspects of what you're doing. It's not only protect the organization, you really it's kind of like a high, right? To continue to operate and to be at the tip of the spear is a high, right? You're hiding the injuries. You don't even know you're in pain, because you're just working your way through it, right? And you're not accepting certain of these things. So to your point, you're absolutely right. It was selfish on my part, and probably to protect them, but I want to say that it was more on I was wanting to continue to operate, and that was probably to the left and to the right of me, of the guys in the team room, probably doing the same thing.
If you talk to them at that point, you talk to your family, you bring them in. Of course, we talked about there's certain things you just can't talk about for security reasons. Are you in as bad a situation as you are at 25 years?
I would say probably definitely not, because there were things that if I would have told them earlier, and that there were things that I would have probably been able to have gotten the level of support that is available now. For example, the SGB. We were doing SGBs 10 years ago. I wasn't even aware. I knew I looked inside the med shed, and something was going on, and I walked right out, right? And then to come find out is that those guys and girls were a little bit smarter than I was, or they were probably had a friend, or they just got picked up, right? Or the doc realized, hey, you're just not right, or they answered the questions right when they went in there, and then they were being treated. Yeah, I mean, it's literally a true story. As I come back and reflect, going, man, what do you mean I could have got an SGB 10 years ago? I probably would have been, a better husband, a better father, a better friend, a son, 10 years ago. If I would have, I know that would have definitely have helped me as an individual.
Well, let's talk about how it all kind of culminates. And you talk about this very candidly. You had two operators that take their own lives. Their deaths are 1 month apart. You were both part of their selection process. You were a mentor to them. You deployed with them in the teams. The sad and the interesting part all kind of mashed together. You said you felt like we failed on our watch to identify what was affecting them and provide help. But my question to you is, because I really started thinking about that after I read that, how do you identify the problem? It's different for every single person. There's no magic looks. There's no magic words they're going to say, especially in the environment that you're in. So how can you look at that as a failure?
I would say now, and would be, there are indications, right? So over drinking, financial problems, marital problems that are bad, right? Like they're just like, in the team room, they're bad, right? And I wasn't any of these, my friends, leaders, and obviously, in small teams, the nucleus will attempt to take care of it internally first, and then you go up the chain of command just to kind of understand what it is. You know, in retrospect, if I do, and there's one of them that I remember walking down the hallway and turning around and seeing his face and just going, there's just something different, right? And it probably had nothing to do leading up to them. I can tell you, there's a lot of thinking, and there's a lot of guys that I've actually talked to now, that we all worked together when we lost these two guys, and they've worked with them too. And we've gone back and we've introspectively talked to each other. And there were things now that I would tell you, yeah, there's signs, there are tales, right? Again, I just said, the drinking, the family problem, the staying late, the not wanting to come do things. Or now I would say, because more importantly is, we know what those individuals have been through. That's point blank. Right now, you've interviewed a lot of guys that came from SF, SMUs and stuff like that. We've put people through in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And so if you've been part of that and you've operated at these levels and you haven't gotten help, then you need to get help. And help can just be having a candid conversation. It can be a brain scan. It can, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm sorry, like, it's a little bit more invasive. It's kind of one of those where you're like, hey, that car needs a maintenance because he's been on the road for 50,000 miles, right? It's like that operator has been in this unit for 10, 15 years, and they haven't stopped deploying because there is no operator, for lack of better words, that gets to stay in the organization 5, 10, 15 years. That unit hasn't been putting them on the road consistently. And if that's so, and if you go back to the maintenance records, and that person hasn't gotten treatment, or their family hasn't gone to marriage counseling, or that person hasn't gone to some kind of cognitive or some kind of medical, and it's just your typical come back in, go see the doc, check, you're certified to go back on status and get out the door. Right. And I don't have the stats. And this is probably one of the things I think that MSOF is looking at, is this data showing where the folks that may have had problems or committed suicide, when you go look backwards, is there were potential indicators.
Well, I think the biggest eye-opening part of this to me was you stated that it put you on your knees and in the darkest corner that you could imagine. What stuck out about that to me was you said you couldn't process it. You could, the only thing that made sense was to immediately ask for help and be the example to others. But after everything you had seen in your life, everything, and believe me, you don't even have to say it. I know you've seen some bad things. What was it about this in particular, with everything that you had done, that rocked you so hard?
They are, for all intents and purposes, even though we're different people, screened, selected, trained, and kept in that organization just like me, right? So we look to the left and to the right of us, right? So a lot of our gauge of what's going on with us and my peers and my mentors is, okay, they're going through the same shit. I can relate to that, right? And again, we travel in very small numbers. We're very, very close to the folks that we work very close from, and so when one guy did it, the first, friend did it, I was like, okay, that was weird. We knew there was something going on. But then a month later, when the second guy, and he was on a different track, his life situations were different, not to get into the details. And then that literally made me look in the mirror, go, if I looked in the mirror to explain it to you, I can see both their faces.
Well, that would beg the question to me then. Did you see your face mixed with theirs? Do you think you're the next one?
Yeah. Why wouldn't I be? Because in my eyes, I had been there. Not that what they had gone through wasn't bad. I had been there, and I don't like how it sounds. I'd been there longer. I knew that I had done different things, but I was already coming apart, and that just opened that we were imperfect, that we can suffer from this. So, no, that in the years that I'd been there, no one had committed suicide compared to the other tiers or the other organizations. So maybe that can paint a clearer picture. So since September 11 till then, we had not lost anybody to suicide, and across the force, there was a lot of numbers of that, right? And one of the things that we were good at is, we can trust folks' resilience, their minds. That's one of the reasons you select people, right? It's not only the physical piece. Yeah, they're good physically, but it's that mental aspect of it. And when they went to that limit, again, we're not perfect. Obviously we're human beings, but I looked at that going, what made those two guys do it? And I'm realizing I'm falling apart, but I didn't realize I had been that falling apart till that happened. That just crushed me, right? So any aspect of me thinking, oh, you're okay, oh, then you're okay, right? You can get through it, and then I'm like, no, my soul just crushed, and it was an anxiety. It was just, it just came crushing down. I mean, I don't think, besides probably losing guys downrange, if they would have been downrange, but I would have been here, that would have been bad. If I would have been down there with them and something happened, that would have been hard. But to have two guys to suicide versus combat, to me was two different things.
So let me ask you, and it might sound like a weird question. For years, we're talking over 20 years, you've been unstoppable. You've been a juggernaut. You've been everything that every kid that plays Army wants to be, right? And then you say that this completely breaks you down. I've got to understand what happens to the ego. With that, because you couldn't get further away on the spectrum.
I think I looked, and I go back to that Pandora's box, right? And I haven't fully, I don't think, got enough therapy. I've got a good amount of therapy, but when I felt that way, I think it was just, it wasn't the chaos from deploying. Maybe that's a good thing. When I went, and I mentioned this the other day, like, I am now learning to be home. I don't think I was home for 20 years. I was always forward, right? I came to deployment, home, and then I went back to a mission. So my blood, what fueled me and my friends, and the mission, and was serving at that capacity. And so when again I obviously, I felt that I was getting slower, right? You're getting older. I'm seeing the cognitive, I'm seeing the
right.
Sleep issues, the relationship, in time, right? And then you're like, okay, I'm obviously not a young guy anymore, but I'm like, okay, I'm not going to be able to. I was having, just really quick, vestibular issues. So muscular skeletal is one thing. I was having vestibular stuff, vestibular. I got vertical really bad. I had to get takeoff of status, and they're like, okay, that's attributable to something really bad. So I started to realize my time was ending, right? Like, hey, you could only really do this long. And to your point, because this happened home, and it was, to me, it's whatever it is to for attention, pull that trigger, for those guys to pull that trigger and to end it. It makes you think, why am I not doing that? With all the moral injuries that I have, with all of the guilt, with all of the stuff that obviously I'm having nightmares, and this, I'm talking backwards, that I didn't even know were in Pandora's boxes, but it's eating me internally, cognitively, emotionally. It's tearing relationships apart. And then that happens, and I think one of your guests had said it one time, you're just like, well, why am I not doing that? Why am I not taking that road? If two guys have done it, right? You just kind of, you go backwards from that. And again, and this is why I said I took a knee, because it was way too easy to go down those same steps, right? Just like they did, and go, well, do they know something I don't know? they're selected and stayed in the same way. Why am I different than them? And why am I not doing it? Because they have families, they have children, they have the same, right? And I am at that point. So hopefully that answered it. It's
It
a
does.
deeper
And
conversation to get to. I don't know the answer.
yeah,
I'm
no,
just
no,
glad
no. I completely understand what you're saying. I think that was George Hand that you're talking about, Geo, that was talking about comparing to the two. An interesting thing, though, that you did was you, on social media, you initiated a buddy check system. You always post on there, hey, long weekend, check on your buddies, check on. What if they don't want to talk? Because that happens a lot.
I will tell you that I have about 10 that are on my, they're my team room, essentially, right? These are 10 guys that I've prioritized, that I just, for as long as I know that, as long as I've known them, what they've gone through, what they're going through, certain conversations we have had, or they keep off the radar, I pick up the phone, right? Or we have our, each guy, this is the unfortunate from most guys, is they all have the unique ways of communicating. So my fail safe for some of these guys was I'll go through the spouse. Hey, just tell so and so I'm trying to get a hold of them. Tell them I love them, and I'm here, right? And it's kind of like sending the smoke signals or the chalk mark on the wall, right? Like they know we made contact, or we went through the ways that we initiate. I got one guy that does Signal, the other guy does Wicker, the other guy does. It doesn't matter. I reach out to those guys, and then also my platform are a way to get to most of these folks, because if I can tell they're monitoring, so I'll try that, right? So some of it, even these buddy checks, is yes, to get other people to do it, because it's starting, to get folks to, hey, if this person's checking on his buddy, maybe I should check on my buddy. That's great. But also overtly, hopefully that also is one way to get to those that maybe not answering the phone, but maybe they're just, in some, white unicorn 001, is their IG handle. They're tracking. And I know some folks are, well, because that's the world we come from, right? Like I'm like, it's either the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, or it's one of my friends that, and they're in this handle, and they're looking at this. So
Let's move on to your transition time, because I think of your entire story, more than battles, more than combat, more than anything, I think your life is the most upended during this. And to read some of the things that you have put on paper, to talk about some of the things that you talked about, is unbelievable to me. And it shows how far you've come from back then till now. You said that it was time to transition or retire from the military. Now, here's where it gets interesting. This would possibly become one of my, and now my family's, most challenging missions ever. I was retiring as a sergeant major. However, I felt like day one entering the military as a private. I spent many hours, days, and long nights planning our next mission, but this time I could ask my spouse for her input. And more importantly, though, I was asking what she needed and wanted from the next phase of our life. Now, there's so many things to unpack just in that statement alone. When you talk about the most challenging mission ever, you're right. Your missions were home. You were gone for so long, missed so many things, just like a lot of law enforcement, a lot of military, a lot of first responders miss these things. But you talk about it being the toughest mission for them too. So we've got to talk about how this has all affected the family, because we talked about your mental health at 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years. Now let's talk about their health at 5, 10, 15, 25. Of course, some weren't around at the 5 and 10 year mark, but we got to talk about the family dynamic, because that's a huge part of this story.
Yeah, so I'll preface it with my son is 16 and he's never PCS'd. Okay. So he's born and raised in the unit. And so this is his life. And his life has always generally been daddy's gone, daddy's training. And it really was mostly daddy's training or daddy's in Germany. That's really what I gave my wife, which I don't even know where to start to thank her because it's me. I told her, hey, unfortunately, the unit's not going to thank you. The Army's not going to thank you. You know, we got spit out, and we're going to move out, and it's now my responsibility once I learn how to walk normal and hopefully crawl, walk, run as a civilian, which is what I'm trying to do at the same time that I heal and see what this family needs, right? And how we go forward. So back to my wife, I met her and I had just been in the unit for a little while, and she had came in from Brazil, so she was a foreigner. Some of her family was here, and when she met me, and this is really quick because then and I'll speed it up. You know, she met me with a big beard. I had, suave looking clothes. I was in DC. We were in line to go to a nightclub. It was snowing. And she was speaking Portuguese with her friend. At that time, I was learning Portuguese. And so I initiate a conversation and this, she just they turn around and she spoke no English, by the way. So my wife, she's going to laugh. All she knew how to speak was the book is on the table. And so when we met, I was going, God, this is a foreigner, right? TSSCI, you're not really in the organization. Engaging relationship with a foreigner is very complicated, right? But I'm like, hey, I didn't even think too much about it. It was the young guy who met her. And so we met, and then subsequently we start to date, and then I'm off, and then I'm back, and then I'm off, and I'm back. And then at that point, it was literally a screening process. And so from the beginning, my poor wife, the first couple of years was literally a screening process. And there was no going to the base. There was no going to the unit. It was this proxy world of a lot of guys and girls coming over, and we would have our parties. And then suddenly folks were always gone. So she started that way, right? In this relationship. And she was only 21 years old, 22. And then, and for her, September 11 had happened. And all of this time, remember, in at least in South America, for her country, with Brazil, they didn't have war. They don't have wars. The military patriotism isn't the same thing. And so I'm developing and cultivating this relationship, and then subsequently get married with someone that culturally doesn't understand the U.S. way of life, right? The military. And then this is not a real regular military, because she's not going into a Fort Bragg or Fort Benning. It's mostly from home, where unit friends come over. So it is also, at that time, it was, hey, I'm leaving. I was going to place X. I'm telling her I'm going to Germany. And then, because again, she's still a foreigner and the family's a foreigner, they weren't U.S. citizen. Yeah, just the level of guilt and the crap that I've got to give back is ungodly. And also the last piece here was no social media. So for the longest time, her friends and her family back in Brazil thought that she was a liar and got knocked up, had a baby, and wasn't really married because, there was no pictures of Erick, which is how you say it in Portuguese, right? There was never any pictures of me on the internet. And so that's what my family life, and it's that also her family just respected that I was just working for the government and I was traveling, and also around in this house was always sanitized. I didn't keep anything here. A lot of almost everything, 95% of it was back at the organization. Right. So you can now imagine what this is like. And so she doesn't know what a PCS move. 2, 3, 4 years in a marriage isn't the same thing, because now we're going 5 years married, 10 years married, 15-year married, right? You're building relationships with other unit members that we're watching their children born all the way to their 14, 15, 16 as well. So when I say this is the hardest thing, it's because I'm now, their life in the military, I probably cheated them out of PCSing and experiencing a normal life, or even being married at the end to a sergeant major that may have had a better life, but my life was always the same, right? I try to keep it consistent. And so transitioning out, because we never thought about moving, we never thought about PCSing, we never thought about we never had to make those other decisions. It was always this gray world, essentially for 18 years, 16 years for my son, which was, okay, I'm not going to spend 6 more months in the military, because again, to the conversation we had earlier, I had that devastating, between my friends, and it made me take a knee, and I'm like, okay, I'm heading towards that retirement now. And that point together is the worst part was me coming home and going, or my first friend committed suicide, and me trying to conceal it, as I concealed a lot of other issues and people dying throughout the force, and things that had happened, or near-death experiences with me that I never talked about. And then now me saying the words, hey, honey, I've been diagnosed with, well, the first one was, my friend committed suicide. Later on, it's attributable to PTS. Then as I asked for help 2 weeks later, when I come back from the medics, they diagnosed me with PTSD, right? And then I come and I tell my wife, at that point, nothing is ever wrong with me, right? Except the few times that maybe I had some elective surgeries, I really never had anything wrong that I would declare. I tell her they diagnosed me with PTS, and at that point, my 14-year-old hears daddy's friend committed suicide because he has PTS, and daddy has PTS. That's the first time my son has really ever seen anything majorly wrong with me. That was critical. And now, how am I supposed to get out? And so as I'm transitioning, almost every other day or every other week, there's an illness, right? Sciatic nerve injuries, you've got TBI, you've got all of these problems. And so my wife is going, what are we going to do? Because now the Army is going to give me back, excuse my French, this piece of shit. You have been constantly able to travel and deploy at a moment's notice. And now that I need you to be the husband, to be the father, after 28 years at this point of service, you can literally at sometimes barely walk because you've got musculoskeletal, you're having memory problems, you're having anger problems, you had friends commit suicide, God knows what's going in your head. And so what that means is, what kind of livelihood are we going to have, and where are we going to go, right? Like, really, where are you going to go? What sort of job am I going to find? Now, I was fortunate that one thing that kept me motivated, and this goes back to some of that mental resilience, because my parents and family did not have an education, I had really good mentoring when I was in the unit to pursue education. I always used education and reading and learning. In my darkest time, it was something that I always did, right? I always wanted to learn, even if it was in whatever aspect. So I went and continued to do my degrees while I was in the unit and in this hellacious rotation. But even then, now my wife, again, to her words, are like, but you're a piece of shit. That's why I said this was literally starting life all over. I should have been ending my military career as an E9, almost 2 master degrees, all of these accomplishments, all of this training, all of this certification, but I can barely want to get out of bed because of the levels of depression, the levels of therapy that was still ahead of me.
So that begs the question, what's your family's new role in your life? Because they're going from a supporting cast to main players. And to that point, do they like you? Do they know you? And And quite frankly, do you know them?
I know them. They have, in bottom line, said at times, I don't know, we don't know you, right? Because as Pandora's box open, you go through these days and weeks of living that manila envelope and seeking that therapy, right? Because it's going to be a long time before I don't do something that's in some level of protectiveness. It's just the way it's in my DNA, right? So I'll do my therapy or I'll go to, even though I'm very good, normally it is the effective after, for example, she knows that the week after next, I'm going to go through my third SGB. So this wasn't, okay, the first two were, this is critical, or I'm going to be, I'm going to be very bad if I don't get these treatments. So, hey, this is our get better plan. So there's a lot of conversations. There's a lot of sometimes by proxy. Some of the things that I say on Instagram is a form of communications. Sometimes there are things that I may post that my wife says, I don't get it. Why did you say that? Or why do you say one thing, but it appears you're doing other things, right? You say take care of, folks take care of your families, but it doesn't seem like you're taking care of the family here. That's a hard one, right? Well, it's true. I'm trying, have these conversations and we're working towards certain things. But sometimes, the leader in me, if you would, or the person trying to help the veterans knows, okay, you should say these things because you've learned to say these things from your experience. But the hardest thing is really sometimes talking to your 16-year-old who's a 16-year-old or your spouse who's like, okay, I don't want to hear that crap today, right? Like you go to your side of the house, I'm going to go to my side of the house, and tomorrow we're going to do it again.
Through all this, you say that you are unpacking 28 years PTSD, TBIs, gunshot wounds, moral injuries. But the interesting one on there to me was fear. Fear of what?
The biggest thing I've feared is compromise. Compromising where I worked and the ability to, there's some things that I hope sometimes when I'm sleeping, I don't say. It's just that aspect, right? Like even right now doing, Echo9.Axiom, I had to do a lot of thinking about how do I go about, talking about my past and where I come from, and I try to keep it. So there's some fear in that, like literally, I've spent the last 20 years in particular protecting an organization, protecting my ability to continue to serve. And sometimes that, and maybe you can relate to it, and I don't know if this is what you mean when I meant fear, but that was a big fear for me, right? Like a big fear for me was not paying bills on time or going in debt or getting a ticket and then losing my clearance or not being able to deploy because of all of this training, all of this mindset, all of the sacrifices that till now I didn't realize I was doing with friends and family, isolating them. That's a fear. There's a fear of there's moral injury that I'm still processing, right? There's a lot of guilt, and guilt is things you've said, things you say, and things you haven't said. I told my wife, and predominantly her, like, hey, I haven't lied to you, but I wasn't able to tell you the truth, right? And so that weighs on you, right? The same thing we just talked about. Hey, I know where I'm going. My team knows where I'm going. I just can't tell you. Well, that's all neat and sexy and fun for the last 19 years. But when you're now a civilian, you're like, fuck, how many times did you say, like, that's not normal? Or like that weighs on you. And so there's that fear. And then there's fear of, I feel better now. There was a lot more fear maybe 2 years ago, as I was getting ready to leave, I was in such pain, muscular, skeletally. My cognitive was, I just couldn't remember things. I just felt like I was a piece of poo poo, right? Like all of that training, all of that experience, and I'm getting to the finish line, and I am now not about to have a career. I know I wanted to do, additional things I thought I needed to do getting out of the military and in special operations. I didn't realize that that was just probably my ego or my just what I was conditioned to do. I have a very satisfied life now, helping veterans and obviously taking care of my family. Hopefully that answers. And if you need to expand on some of that fear.
No. That's exactly what I was looking for, was because I think that people think of fear as very concrete things. And I think with you, and I think with a lot of people, it's more of a mental thing. It's not a concrete thing that you're scared of. You're scared of failure and all these things that people have never had to deal with, because let's be honest, special missions unit, you don't fail that often, if ever. You know what I'm saying? So you go
Yep.
20, 25 years of never failing to falling on your face. That's a scary, scary thing.
Well, you fail here, and again, that the mirror changed, right? So now this is my mission. My mission is home. And so this is not what I've been used to doing. This is what I've been used to avoiding. I've been used to avoiding almost with everything that I was trained to do, avoiding being home, right? Just long enough that I can deploy again, long enough that, and I haven't got into those photos yet where I am sitting around and there's photos taken of me in the last 20 years in family functions, and I'm on the computer or I wasn't at that party. I wasn't at my son's birthday party. I'm literally researching aspects of what I need to do, or I'm learning another language, or I'm taking my wife and family through Germany or wherever we're going, and I'm doing tradecraft training, right? Like I am just constantly nonstop reinforcing what we're doing all the time. And now I'm just like, how am I supposed to really be a husband? How am I really supposed to be a dad? My son's up there playing Call of Duty and he's like, yeah, whatever, dude. And it's just like, you weren't here. Like, now is not the time to talk about that. I'm like, oh, God. Right. And that is a fucking blow to the gut. Like there's no tomorrow. It's one thing to we fail. I mean, that's part of our adapting. It's not total failure, but
Right.
you're adjusting all the time when you're downrange all the time, and that's what and we don't give up type thing. But when you're here and that family gets upset at you and they turn around and they walk away from you, you're just like, oh fuck, what now? I can't go to the team room because I can't get back in the building, right?
Right.
Like I'm gonna have to sit here and absorb it now. And even though some of that mental, like, and it's a good point about even some of the mental stuff. I will go back to essentially, if you would, like a Rolodex of your training. I'm like, I'm gonna, and I have an argument with my wife, or something happens, or you hit a speed bump now as a civilian. I'm like, I'm gonna go find a little corner and I'm gonna roll up and I'm gonna crawl up into a little ball, right? And sometimes I'll have, I did that before. Then there was things that I started to slowly come back, which is go for a walk, right? So I did start reaching back to my toolkit, but it was really desperate in that aspect to like, I go, okay, I can do the civilian thing. Just, go back to therapy, which we're not used to doing therapy, go back to those tools, right? And so that's helped me, but it's also helped my family when my wife's like, hey, it's time for you to go for a walk, because when you go for a walk, you come back, right? So
Well, and we'll get into get up and go in a little bit. I want to ask the last two things before we get into the therapy, the meat of this. I want to know your biggest piece of progression after getting out and going through all this. Your best thing that's happened to you in your progression, and I want to know your biggest setback.
progression would be sleep, right? My ability to enjoy sleep, to really want to sleep. It's probably biggest thing, because I've always known sleep is important, but it just seems that every time you're out the door, you always forego sleep, because you're always, you're doing everything for long hours, or you don't realize then, to your point earlier, 5, 10, 15 years, you're actually sleeping less because you're all fucked up, right? Like you're going to sleep because you're drinking, you're exhausting yourself mentally, and then you're getting up 3 to 4 hours later, and you're actually operating. Some other guy said it. You're like dangerously operating, right? And so in my transition process, medically, in some of the treatment, once I learned to sleep well, and how that made me feel cognitively, emotionally, and my my behavior, and how that reflected with my family, that was key, right? And that I'm really big now on just on sleeping, and the power behind it. Setback would still be, it's probably like some levels of doubt, in aspects to, in doing some of the stuff for Echo9, and when I look at some of these photos, I don't only post a photo just because it's a cool guy photo. I try to use it. It's kind of part of my art therapy, right? So that art therapy, I'm horrible at drawing, so I was able to go to the digital photo and then create words or meaning out of it, right? So either if I remember what I was thinking or going through during that photo, or fear, I'll relate it to that. But on some occasions, in some of this looking in, and even trying to do some writing, I'm trying to capture some of it. It will take me down these little rabbit holes that I hadn't fully opened. So it's kind of like I became more vulnerable the longer I've been out, because of the importance to take care of family. And that meant get through that therapy aspect faster. And so sometimes that therapy will knock me down. Like it'll just have an emotional impact. But now I'm like, okay, there's no more putting it back in Pandora's box, right? Before in therapy, they're like, hey, we're only going to open it for a little bit because you got to get through stage 1. Because if you go straight to the deep end, you may drown, Eric. And so it is probably now absorbing those things are a little harder for me. I think that's, hopefully that's what answers for you is that, and what that will do for me sometimes is it'll hurt your motivation to sometimes, like if I work from home a lot and I don't get out and have some other things to do, it can make you take a knee, right? Like you can be happy-go-lucky, motivated, right? You just came from a walk, but you open that little box and you start thinking about it because you want to work through it. It can hurt.
Well, let's talk about all these therapies, because that's how we kind of came across each other. And this SGB is awesome. I watched you the other night. You hosted a deep dive with a lot of different things, and I got to be honest with you. I thought there was some strange things that came out in that when they started talking about the psychedelics and different stuff like that. What was interesting about it, though, when I saw all that stuff, is how hard I think they're trying to break through in one way or the other to really get a hold of this problem, because it's a problem. Don't anyone fool yourself that it's not a problem, because it is. But it was so, I guess the word would be comforting to hear that so many people are trying so many different approaches to get PTS under control. And let's start with SGB, because you've already talked about it once. I've talked to Dr. Lynch on here, and then his partner, Sean Mulvaney. You're getting ready to go in for your third one. I want you to tell, because as we talk to him about it and what it's about and what it can do, I want you to tell, being you, everything that you went through and getting that, how you felt and what it did for you.
So the first one, I cried. I literally was a ball of tears when I woke up. It felt just like folks would say, it like you took off that 75-pound ruck that you had been wearing for 6 hours. It just physically, it just felt like your body's relaxed, and then all of a sudden, once you're feeling like it felt relieved and light. And then I went straight to sleep when by the time I got home. And then I had slept like I hadn't slept in 20 something years. It was just an amazing sleep. But when I got up and I got through a little bit of the sort of drugginess, and I was like a little baby, right? Like I was telling my wife she had to contact my PA, and I'm like, I don't know what this is about, because I was very skeptical about it. But then I was feeling good. I had gotten sleep, and then I went back up to go to the bed, and I had done it post the guys committed suicide, and that thought had just came in, and I just started to cry, and then I started to it was just this. I hadn't been able to cry, right? Like I had seen horrors, things that happened, and even when the guys had killed themselves, I hadn't had that emotion. I wasn't able to cry at that level, and it was just like deep crying. And it also relaxed me, right? Because I was balled up. I was angry. I think I threw like a chair across the living room at some point weeks prior to that, because you didn't realize that you had, right, all the PTS. You also have these flares of anger, and and then I felt myself being able to calmly process stuff. And then, which was good with my wife, she was able to tell me that I looked different. My shoulders were down. I looked rested. She saw me cry, right? I was emotional, or we would start talking about something, and then you just start bawling. Yeah, that was then for me from the beginning of the therapy, because at that point I hadn't asked for help, right? And I don't know if before that they put you like on, if I had done the SGB and then antidepressant, or one of the other ones came, but that had its greatest impact. I want to say the SGB was first. That had its greatest, it literally was just, imagine just something that hurt you for 20 years, and then all of a sudden you're just like, okay, that feels amazing.
Second one
was then part of when I went to NICO. So even though I had that SGB, I was feeling good. There were other things that now were the stresses of getting out of the military, right? Going through the paperwork, getting out of the Army, the special operations system, and going to the regular, and dealing with the regular. It was just a lot of now that anxiety and that stress. And then I went to NICO, to National Interpretive Center of Excellence for Traumatic Brain Injuries. And during that process, that was then mixed with the program that I was going through. So I had done sleep therapy again. They had done then some tests, and which also became stressful, because they're like, hey, you've got TBIs. Yes, you have PTS at this level. You have, NICO was kind of like a 2x4 to the head as far as medical, because my docs would just patch you up, right? They were incredible at patching us up. But I'm like, stop patching me up, because I need to retire. I need to put this shit in the system, or I'm not going to take care of my family when it comes time to the VA, right? So NICO, even though I was learning art therapy, music therapy, and I was getting, good treatment, it's also a 2x4 to the gut, because every time I got home after the session, they're like, you've got this, you got celiac, or you've got this in your hands, or you've got these tears, or we got these spots in your brain, or you're just like, oh my God, right? That's what I was telling you earlier. You just feel like I'm a piece of crap. Right. So I'm like, can I go get a second SGB, right? And they're like, oh, well, and it was part of the therapy. And plus that therapist, and there's a key point here, it's external talk therapy. When I was inside my organization, there are people that have known me for 15 years. So talking to a therapist that's known you for a long time, there's a bias, right? And so when you start all over with, and that team at NICO is amazing because it's like 12 professionals and one lead doctor. These people just start all over from the beginning. They don't know you, but they're just taking all of this data and they're actually asking you things in a way that you didn't even know the answer until they asked you in a certain. That's how I actually knew that I had been suffering from PTS when I had gotten shot. It wasn't until I was there that then manifested. And they're like, "Aren't you aware you already had PTS?" I'm like, "Absolutely not." That second STB was then it helped me get through that transition medical process because again, it just removed, another layer of another backpack that I had, which is where I'm at now with the third one, which is okay. I'm now at the third phase, I think, of my transition as a civilian and the little pieces of the Pandora's box that I've been opening. But really, it's because I've been TDY at home now for a year and a half. So it's time to now process that aspects and these new, I don't want to say they're new manifestations of PTS, but they're things that were probably so deep at the bottom of the totem pole that I now need to also, use the SGB to help me continue to heal and grow better.
Well, wouldn't you agree, though, that some of that stress, too, is the new role you've taken on in life? That's post-traumatic stress. It's been a year now.
Well, I mean, here's what, and the stats. I mean, most guys that come from, or girls, I guess, that come from these units, you're getting divorced a year out. So a lot of the divorces are actually been happening a year as a person's getting out and a year and a half after, as well as that's the window for suicide. So there's a lot of suicides post-retirement, right? So you enter, and when I wrote that before, I wasn't as clear, but it is literally another little war, right? Post-retirement, there are times that you don't know how this relationship is going to go, because my wife has, secondary PTS, as Tom Satterlee's Jen Satterlee talks about, that the spouses also. So now they are also talking about their PTS and their stresses, right? That brings, there are things that we've talked about that I'm just like, oh my God, you're talking about something that's 19 years ago, but it's just as vivid for my spouse yesterday as it was 19 years ago. So you're right, that is causing a level of stress because for all intents and purposes, we forget about it or we've moved on from it because but it's here and alive. So now you got to work through that.
Or you never knew about it because you said lot during your deployments, there wasn't a lot of talking about stuff that was going on.
You don't talk about it or you didn't listen. And that's, I want to say more so, I probably didn't listen and it just, she was probably telling me, and one thing that I had with my spouse, I've said, hey, I'm pretty sure that if you say I did something wrong, there's a high likelihood that I did fuck it up, that I do take responsibility. Because as I look back, I'm just like, man, dude, you just worried about getting out the door, right? Like that's all. And I would sacrifice, meaning, yes, honey, whatever, somebody will come fix it and then boom, I'm out. Right. And now I'm having to feel those emotions and, and I essentially is you're both going through therapy in some form.
Well, you listen to the show, you have for a while, you hear guy after guy or person after person on the show say the exact same thing. And that's a big point that I always try and drill into because it's crazy to think about as a normal person or as a normally prudent person. It's weird to say I couldn't wait to get away to go do this. And then when it's all over, you go, well, I missed out on all this stuff because I couldn't take my head out of the game for 5 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how, that's a really good point. And it so yeah, they're essentially the Pandora's boxes from work. I guess equally would be those containers of things that I missed. That one of the things I love doing now as a civilian, and our minds were constantly engaged as we talked about the fight, the mission, the training. I now post retire. One of the things I like to do, and I recommend to people, I'm going back to that. Well, that honey to do list never went away, and the Erick to do list, right? Like there are things that I want to do. Like I want to scan photos that are 20 years old, that they were the paper photos, or and then I'm looking at them and I'm scanning and I'm seeing pictures that I don't remember. I don't remember my kid riding bicycle, my kid in that soccer game. And again, that's a gut punch because I care and I love my family. And then I realize, and I've even gone back to go, okay, what was the date on that photo? I'm like, oh yeah, December 2006. The selfish me is going, yeah, you were getting blown up. You're in a firefight in Ramadi looking for HVT number, whatever. Erick home now is going, yeah, but your son was learning how to ride bike, or your son always got sick when I left, right? And so that impact of that reality is settling in. So as, probably a recommendation as we kind of talk our way through that is that as if you're at the point that where I'm at now and the persons are retiring, like it's hard. Like you got another, there's another phase. That's why I mentioned this other next phase to me is harder because I can't go back to the team room and get the tools from the team room. Like I got to wake up and get the strength. And my mission now is take care of my family. It is take care of me, which also a lot of guys didn't really take care of themselves. I think it's that emotional side we didn't. We took care of our bodies. We took care of our ability to shoot, move, and communicate, but we really didn't take care of our minds and our emotions. That I think is something, as you mentioned, that I think it's very key for folks to understand. Hey, man, you can be a good operator, who whatever you do, but you got to take care of that mind, and that's not really that mental health aspect of it.
Talk to us about Military Special Operations Family. I think that this is kind of the culmination of your story. Everything, especially in the last word of it, family and collaborative. Family, because that's what you're focused on now. Collaborative, as you're taking everything that you've done from knowing what to do in the military, from being that mentor, and now being a civilian and a dad and a husband, and putting it all into this. So let's talk about that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I appreciate that opportunity. So what I really like about MSOF's Military Special Operations Family Collaborative, and it's a nonprofit, right? And so they've been around 2 or 3 years. And they are about the research, the education, and the connection, right? There are lots of nonprofits. And before they, kind of became a team member with them, I was on the board of directors on another nonprofit that was very specific to, a segment of special operations. But what MSOF does is ensures that they are gathering, for example, SGB, right? Like, hey, here is the research, here is the proving data, and then essentially, leadership. They have done and done training at the Army Special Operations Command. So certain commands have asked MSOF through their sort of training curriculum. And it's just a perspective, right? They get the data, they get the research, they have all the resources, and then they teach a command. And I think that's important, right? And the reason I like it is, obviously I came from one place 20 years, and certain organizations, just like anything, have their own cultures. But what that also means is then they have their own ways of thinking. That can also be good, but that also can be bad. And so sometimes you can't help yourself if you group think, right? And so what I like what MSOF is doing is going, I can probably have gone back, and this is just a wild example. Our organization, the organization I came from, was good about SGB because I did get the opportunity to go, but maybe they may not be very leaning forward as maybe the SEALs who may be looking. I think they were earlier on looking at psychedelics or some other sorts of treatments. Well, what MSOF is doing is literally going across the board and looking at these best practices, looking at the research, right? And then sharing that information. And so you're not stuck going, okay, this is just the way that Special Forces wants to do it, where the Rangers want to do it this way, the SEALs are doing it this way, this SMU is doing it that way, and then the Air Force is doing it one way. This, at least, I don't have to worry about those little tribes. It is just at this level is proven data, proven research, right? Best practices, and then you bring in, as you said in that last one, we had amazing doctors talk about one aspect of treatment, and what we're trying to do is just like what I'm doing is sharing my story, but look at other folks who have gotten some of these treatments that are now leading treatments, and we share that information. Hey, the SEALs have been working at this, the Rangers are doing this, SF Command is looking at this, and I think that's just incredible to be able to share that information. And then the collaborative is a lot of people sharing information back with us, which is great.
Well, what's next for you?
I'm in my crawl phase, right?
Okay.
So right now, we are thinking about moving. This will be for me and for my family, the last phase of really disassociating from the military, because we have been here so long. And it's, somebody had told me about, like, you really have to, when you retire, it's recommended that you either, you move on, right? Unless you were fortunate enough to be working, or you were stationed somewhere where your family, like your family's from. I didn't know where Maryland was when I was in Hialeah, right? Just kind of jokingly, or this, this national capital region, for so long that, again, I was, as you had mentioned, I asked my wife, where do we want to go? You've got the opportunity. So we're looking at going to Florida, right? So that's one aspect is, and I'm used to doing a million things at one time. I've now realized, nope, let's focus right now and give it a lot of attention on, as a family, preparing to get up and move. And what does that go with it? Meaning I've secured, obviously, my pension as a retired E9. I put the time in with my family and the work to get my VA compensation. So I'm comfortable with that aspect of it, right? Where if I need to choose a different career to take care of my family, I can do that, right? So I have some options. I either stay in the defense industry, or I go work for Google, or I set up and become an entrepreneur. I have those. I have that option openly that can support my family. And so literally right now I'm at the whiteboard. I'd like to later on continue to pursue higher education. I was focused before. I wanted to finish a PhD. I realized with all the cognitive issues I had before, it was more of a struggle. But now, as I look at that aspect, I want to bring in more of, for example, this stuff with PTS, TBI, military endurance. So, nothing easier than think about writing a paper or a document and working backwards to try to solve something. So I'm going to challenge myself in that aspect.
Well, you have an amazing story from start to finish, from Cuba to all the way here. Do you ever look back and just, I know there's been a lot of trauma. I know there's been a lot of triumphs, but just how blessed you've been to have this life that you've had?
Yeah, I feel absolutely blessed. I thank my parents, for my family, for taking that courageous flight, leaving Cuba, and coming to Hialeah, and then those people that welcomed my family. So I will always remember that, what it is to be an immigrant and the opportunities and take advantage, and not take advantage of them and serve, but yeah, take advantage of them in aspects to give back. Been fortunate to have met my wife and have my wonderful, my son, and just amazing people that I've met. And, and there's a part of it of what I've been able to accomplish. There's still a part of me that I've learned to now look at the news, and go, okay, that's not my war physically anymore. My next battle, as I've mentioned, is I know as a leader, is to give back. If I can give back to those that are in service right now, help them, help their families and their children, right? Provide a perspective. It's just if I can share my vulnerabilities as a strength and give that perspective to someone, then I know I have a continued mission, right? And that's purpose, and we all need purpose, so that's important. And so I'm happy now. I'm just trying to take care of that family, trying to take care of myself to be a better person, and just enjoying life and just blessed.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to go down a list of where everyone can get a hold of you and kind of donate to the organization. Now, Military Special Operations Family Collabrative, that is msofc.org. I'll say it again, msofc.org. You can actually go to that website, learn more about what's going on, learn about their team members, and learn about the mission that they're doing. You can also go there and donate, and that really helps out the organization by donating to them. Also, if you want to find Erick, you can find him on Instagram at Echo9.Axiom and Echo9.Hopes. You can find him on Facebook at all capital letters Echo9, or you can find him at Erick Miyares. Is there anywhere else that they can find you, or anything else that you want to plug?
Just that you can find me on LinkedIn from a professional perspective. But for the most part, if you want to follow me on IG, that's great. That's normally where I like to put the information on Axiom. And then, folks can communicate with me on DM. Takes me a little while to get back to them, but I do tend to get back to folks. And thank you for the opportunity to be in here and share my story. And as always, I'm always so surprised of what actually comes out, depending the host. And you've been amazing of asking that question and being patient with me. And I appreciate that.
Well, guys, I think that's going to be it for the show tonight. If you want more of me, you can always find me on Instagram at the DTD_podcast. You can find me on Facebook at the DTD podcast. You can find me on YouTube, where all these conversations are in video form, at the DTD podcast. Guys, don't forget to talk with our partners or look at their website at the Stellate Institute. This SGB thing, I'm telling you, is an amazing, amazing procedure that is helping tons of people, and they hope to help millions more. That's going to be it for tonight. That's Erick. I'm DJ. This has been the show. We'll catch you guys on the next one. See you later.